Hello, everybody. My name is Professor Rob McDonald from the United States Military Academy, and I am here with my friend, Professor Kevin Gutzman from Western Connecticut State University. He is the author of a brand new book called The Jeffersonians, the Visionary Presidencies of Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. And we're here to have a pretty casual, relaxed, and informal discussion over the course of the next hour. So Kevin, welcome.
Thanks, Rob. Happy to be here.
Yeah, this is great. Nice way to end the semester and begin the holidays. And when I think of various gifts that people could receive, I have to tell you, a book on these administrations is right up there. And that's not a shameless plug. I've taught the Early Republic course at West Point for many years. And it strikes me that there really isn't any recent book that covers the presidencies of Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. Am I wrong, or have you really done something here that's overdue and very much needed?
And I'm not aware of any other book that does this. No, that's what led me to the idea. There, of course, is a tendency among scholars to think of the period as having had a break at 1815, and the conceit underlying the book is that no, there wasn't. And I hope that people who read the book will come to the same conclusion, among other conclusions.
So, the book is called The Jeffersonians. I guess that gives a little bit of due deference to Thomas Jefferson, who is the namesake of the party of the Jeffersonian Republicans, which took shape in the 1790s in opposition to, many of the policies of Alexander Hamilton and his coalition of partisans, the Federalists. To what degree do you think these presidents all can be considered Jeffersonian? I mean, are they really all that similar in terms of their outlook, in terms of their agenda, in terms of their ideology? Or, do you, well, I've read the book, so I know, but tell us how you perceive there might be some shades of difference between the three.
Well, I do think that all three of them thought of themselves as pursuing a common program. It's certainly the case that, for example, Monroe was more interested in achieving a point at which there was no party division in the country. I think that he took significant steps to ensure that the Federalist Party and the Republican Party would be no more. And this was fully in keeping with what Jefferson said in his first inaugural address. People supposedly in the audience gasped when he said, "We have called by different names, brethren, of the same principle. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists." But I think he meant it. I think he had the idea that there had been a kind of deformity of American society in the 1790s. And now Americans could be back to a situation in which being citizens of a common republic meant that they were in some sense all friends. That's what he hoped for.
Mm-hmm. Boy, that sounds good. I think there are plenty of people today who pine for the same sort of possibility. I wonder, though, I mean, certainly parties are an extra constitutional feature of the American political system. They were not envisioned by the framers of the Constitution. George Washington very much wanted to pursue a course of unity. I think you would agree. He saw himself, solidifying these bonds, which at that point really were perceived by many to be quite fragile. The American Revolution, we knew what we were against. We're against rule by the British. But what exactly are we for is a different and perhaps more difficult question. And, I think it's a question that animates a lot of the debates of the 1790s. You talk a good deal about Thomas Jefferson's inaugural address, and I'll point out, I mean, when you say that this is a book about the administrations of Jefferson and Madison and Monroe, it really is, and you really do begin, with the presidency of Thomas Jefferson. There's not a whole lot of backward glances. So on March 4th, 1801, when Jefferson, stands in front of Congress and the people in the audience and reads aloud his inaugural address, what's the vision that he puts out there?
Well, besides the fact that he hopes party contestation is behind, he looks forward to a day when people will be free to make their own way in the economy, that the burden of the federal government on them will be substantially reduced from what it has been in the 1790s, that there won't be the kind of reflexive animosity toward people who have different political views that there has been, that when it comes to the military, the first recourse will be to reliance on the militia, that there shouldn't be a contest between the United States on one hand and Spain, France, and Britain when it comes to naval armaments. Essentially, he thinks that Americans should be free to make their own way, and that the government of the 1790s really has kept them from doing that. So the changes he envisions are going to be in a liberal direction. That is, that he wants to have substantially lessened burden on your typical citizen from the federal government. And he'd like to see decision-making decentralized as much as practicable. Of course, that means that common people who can't really be involved in making decisions in Congress can be involved in shaping their own lives as far as practicable. They can be involved in making decisions in their own wards, that is, their own precincts. So it's democratic, the lowercase d. That is, he hopes that his program is going to mean that people are going to be freer than they've been before, and he thinks that'll mean that they're friendlier than they've been before. Right. He says that getting rid of the old party animosity means eliminating a barrier to friendly interaction among Americans that has to some extent made life not worth living. Mm. So he's very, very hopeful. And another way to see it is that he thinks that at last Americans have decided they all agree with him, which of course is a bit of a reflection of his own
optimism.
Yeah, well, his optimism that people all agree with him on all the particulars is perhaps a conceit that is a little bit appealing, but it is a conceit, of course.
So, when I think about the first inaugural address, two sets of quotes come to mind. One you've already shared with us. Jefferson says, we're all Republicans, we're all Federalists. Let's set that to the side for just a second. The other one that comes to mind is when Jefferson, I think he asks, what remains to close the circle of our felicities? We have so many great advantages as Americans. And then he says, one thing more, my fellow citizens, a wise and frugal government, which shall restrain men from injuring one another, shall otherwise leave them free to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement, and shall not take from the mouth of labor the bread it has earned. This, he says, is the sum of good government. And when you add it all up, there's really not much in the addition column there. I mean, he says what government shouldn't do. It shouldn't regulate people's pursuits of industry and improvement, and it shouldn't take, the fruits of their hard-earned labor. It says essentially government should prevent people from injuring one another. That's not a whole lot. That's a pretty radically limited vision for government. And I'm just curious, how well do you think Jefferson manages to carry that vision into reality?
Well, he, of course, thinks that via the Louisiana Purchase, the federal government has made possible that the descendants of the people who are hearing him or reading about it can be farmers to, he says, the thousandth and thousandth generation. So obviously he's not looking to substantial immigration, but we know that Jefferson thought that the ideal life for a Republican was that of an independent farmer. And now he would be able to be that if there weren't some other wrong-headed fellow in charge of the federal government, that there was now enough farmland even for younger sons and youngest sons to move west and put their plow to work. And I think that the unforeseeable territorial acquisition that the United States accomplished during this 24-year period could have made that possible if that had been a shared goal. Of course, it turns out it wasn't really a shared goal, but certainly Jefferson was sanguine in the hope that there would be many generations of people who now could be independent Republican farmers, that they would be able to cast their votes, as was done in those days, at least in Virginia, orally, secure in the knowledge that it wouldn't redound to their detriment economically because they were independent.
Right.
So he was very successful at it. It wasn't really because of any genius on his part, though. It was more kind of fortuitous circumstance that Napoleon decided, well, Louisiana isn't worth my effort. I guess I'll maximize my profit from it by selling it to the Americans. But yeah, I think he was very successful, and that's why within a very short time the opposition party would cease to exist.
Of course, Henry Adams, who is perhaps one of the first historians to give us a version of the 1801 to 1815 book, with his history of the administrations of Presidents Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Adams wrote that it's hard to imagine any president who would be more of a Federalist than Thomas Jefferson himself. And Henry Adams points to things like the Louisiana Purchase as evidence that Jefferson is actually willing to flex the national government's muscles and willing perhaps to broadly interpret the Constitution. Well, you want to tell us a little bit more about that and maybe share your take on that?
Well, of course, what he has to do to come to that conclusion is to agree with Jefferson, who was isolated among leading Republicans in having his constitutional scruples touched by the idea of buying Louisiana. Of course, people like Madison said that since Article 2 of the Constitution said that the president could enter into treaties with the advice and consent of the Senate, but didn't specify what kinds of treaties, that the obvious reading was that included all of the kinds that were common at the time the Constitution was adopted, which, although now wouldn't include treaties to purchase territory from other countries, then did include treaties to purchase territories for other countries. So even the greatest constitutional sticklers among the Republican leadership didn't have any problem with this. Only Jefferson seems to have had a constitutional problem with this. And I guess in this case, I agree with the majority. Of course, his position was, if I find myself out of step with the majority of Republicans, I must conclude that I'm mistaken, which would have led him to change his mind about that, even if he hadn't already been talked into it. But I think it's a cute move by Adams to try to hold Jefferson up against his own principles in this case. But I actually think Madison was right about that.
It is an interesting situation. I mean, so first of all, we should make clear that everybody who's listening understands the Constitution doesn't grant the national government the power explicitly to add new territory.
Right.
And you can make the argument, as Madison did, and I believe Treasury Secretary Albert Gallatin did, that through the treaty-making process, the national government could, in fact, acquire additional territory. And that's what they went with, of course, with the approval of the Senate and the House of Representatives funded the Louisiana Purchase Treaty of 1803. So in the eyes of many, it's constitutionally sound. But Jefferson has his doubts. And of course, he desperately wants to purchase Louisiana. As you pointed out, in the early 19th century, in Jefferson's eyes at least, we're sitting on this ticking demographic time bomb. I mean, our population is doubling every 20 years. And if we are going to sustain ourselves as a nation of virtuous family farmers and not become increasingly quartered and densely populated cities where people are exploited as wage laborers and working for others and losing their own independence of means, which could lead to a loss of one's intellectual independence. We needed to find some way to perpetuate, this nation that is based on agriculture. And so Louisiana is a wonderful solution to that problem. It also solves a foreign policy problem. If we don't possess the land west of the Mississippi River, someone else will. Spain was about to pass it along to France via treaty. France, of course, seemed, it was almost like a law of physics that France was at war with Great Britain, which of course occupied Canada to our north. So certainly our neutrality would be compromised if we're geographically located in between French territory and British territory. So there were all these things sort of compelling us to want to purchase Louisiana. Jefferson thinks it's a wonderful idea, but he is so hung up on the belief that it does not have constitutional sanction that he goes to the effort of actually drafting an amendment to the Constitution that would explicitly allow it. So tell us a little bit about that. I mean, what happens? That sounds like the perfect solution. If we're not sure, let's amend the Constitution and let the states explicitly authorize this enterprise.
Well, again, Jefferson was apparently the only prominent Republican who wasn't sure that this was constitutional under the vague language of Article 2's treaty provision. And so, yes, he did draft a constitutional amendment, but he immediately received correspondence from Livingston, one of the two ministers who had purchased or who had agreed with the French government that America would purchase Louisiana, saying, look, Bonaparte has already changed his mind about this. If you don't hurry up and accept it, then it's going to be too late. And France is just going to say, no, we're not going to go through with this sale. So Jefferson seems to have decided, as he said, that he would make the purchase and then throw himself on the mercies of the electorate insofar as his own constitutional scruples were concerned. I don't think that his constitutional scruples were widely known at the time, though. So there doesn't seem to have been any significant controversy about this, at least among Republicans, after the purchase was made. In fact, it made him extremely popular. This is one of the main achievements, maybe the main achievement of his 8 years as president. So his own antsiness about it is kind of amusing in retrospect.
No, I mean, certainly you're right. And if he was throwing himself upon the mercy of the voters were quite merciful in return because, of course, the election of 1804 was a blowout. I mean, traditionally, New England had been a hotbed of federalism, and, the middle states and the southern states and the West was the point of strength for the Jeffersonian Republicans. But even Massachusetts, the Federalist Death Star, voted for Thomas Jefferson in 1804. I mean, it was incredible. It was incredible. And yet, I will say, maybe judged from the vantage point of 1804, this is a very sound decision. But maybe from the vantage point of 1864 or even 1854, it's not. In other words, the Constitution, if you want to envision it as a marriage between North and South, with the addition of Louisiana, suddenly becomes this weird kind of menage a trois with the West, right? And the question is the West going to be like the North, or is the West going to be more like the South? Are the future residents of Kansas going to be cod fishermen like the people of Massachusetts, or are they going to be farmers like the people of Virginia? And of course, in the early part of the 19th century, slavery has yet to rear its head as an important national issue. But it soon will, beginning in the 1820s, and of course the question of admitting new states. Will they be a slave state? Will they be a free states? I mean, in some ways, the tension between the North and the South, running up to the Civil War, is a tension about the character of the West. And so I can't help but think that maybe Jefferson deserves more credit than he is conventionally given for his misgivings.
Well, it's an interesting question whether the sectional crisis of the 1850s is a result of slavery per se, or whether slavery is the issue that people in especially New England who were unhappy with Southern domination found was the most useful one they could use to try to elevate themselves back into control of the federal government. I don't know the answer to that question, but people do tend to think of it now as having been divisive because of its own inherent strength as an issue. It's not clear to me. People in New England already had the idea that they were unhappy with dominance by the Virginians long before slavery became a hot sectional question.
Sure. We could maybe skip ahead to Madison's administration. And, at the height of the War of 1812, New England Federalists come together in Hartford, Connecticut in December of 1814 and January of 1815 for the Hartford Convention. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that and some of the things you discovered?
Well, one interesting thing that's not in the book is I live in Connecticut now, and when the bicentennial of the Hartford Convention rolled around, there was complete silence. No, there was no commemoration. There was no mention of it, even among historians. It just passed, which was kind of amusing, I think. But the Hartford Convention followed the effort for several years by Timothy Pickering and Gouverneur Morris, who had been prominent earlier, to saw off New England and maybe New York with New England into a separate country because they thought that the Jeffersonian foreign policy was essentially inherently pro-French in the ongoing dispute, as you've said, endless tension between France and Britain. And so it seemed to them that, number one, they didn't like being in a society that was dominated and apparently would always be dominated by Virginia. And number two, they thought that besides that, when it came to France and Britain, New England was far more like Britain anyway. So why shouldn't this lead to separation? And then, of course, when the war came, a lot of people in New England, including Governor Strong of Massachusetts, were completely opposed, and you end up with substantial smuggling by New England farmers into Canada, which is to say into British Empire, and there definitely was more sectional feeling in New England than patriotic feeling, I think, during the War of 1812. That's one point that the book makes in some detail, I think.
I mean, it is incredible because it strikes me that one theme that runs throughout your book is this question of partisanship. And, Monroe, at the end of his two, by all accounts, at the time at least, successful terms, very much envisions leaving a great gift to America, the gift of a nation without two political parties. And yet I wonder if that is somehow quixotic, if somehow that's a pipe dream. If people are just naturally inclined to gravitate toward one team or another team. I mean, it doesn't have to be this way. I think, George Washington certainly believed that people would disagree about particular issues, but that the same people would be disagreeing about different issues, that, the people over here would agree about domestic policy and foreign policy and taxes and customs and everything. And that, the people on the other side would all be in agreement on those issues with each other and in disagreement with the other party. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, is this dream of nonpartisanship, is it going to always remain a dream? I mean, does history, or at least the history of the first quarter of the 19th century, suggest that people are hardwired somehow to be partisans?
Well, one thing that this question shows us is that the significance, the pervasion of the knowledge of the Federalist is drastically overrated today. That is, apparently, although Madison wrote in the Federalist that party division was inevitable in a complex society, his friend, top cabinet member and successor as president, James Monroe, was not persuaded by that argument. So it does seem that people naturally divide even on trivial questions. They end up dividing over leaders' personalities and other inanities. quite heatedly, we see in our own day. So there obviously is a kernel of truth in that, although on the other hand, people in the Monroe administration, not just in the government, but people in those years were happy with the idea that there was some kind of meeting of the minds between leading Federalists and leading Republicans.
Mm-hmm.
We can kind of imagine that now, even if the way toward it doesn't seem obvious. And Monroe certainly thought that was an achievement. He thought this was a wonderful outcome.
It's interesting. I mean, Jefferson himself seems to be maybe of two minds on this question. I mean, you can find some letters at various points in his life where he writes that some people are naturally Tories, as he describes them, and others are naturally Whigs. And I think by using those terms, he meant some people are naturally friends of centralization and consolidation and political. The vigorous use of political authority, whereas others are, maybe more liberty loving and have a more hands-off vision for government. In his first inaugural address, to go back to the second major quote, this is the one that all the textbooks highlight. As we've pointed out, Jefferson said that we are all Republicans, we're all Federalists. Most textbooks seem to take that to mean that he was saying that we are somehow all members of the Republican Party, yet also we're all members of the Federalist Party. And yet, as you point out in his inaugural address, he doesn't capitalize those terms. Of course, we both know he doesn't capitalize much of anything at all. It's just the idiosyncrasies of the Jeffersonian pen. But do you think he means something else? Or at least something else as well? I mean, is this a rhetorical sleight of hand? Is he saying one thing, but he wants people to hear another thing? Or is he saying what he wants people to hear, but they misread his remarks?
Well, I think he has in mind that Americans are Republican in the sense they don't want monarchical government, and they're Federalist in the sense they want a union of the states. But he thinks people have concluded that the Republican Party was right in the contest of the 1790s. That's why in his old age he referred to this as the Revolution of 1800. It was the culmination of the revolution, his having won. So it's hard to overstate the strength of his ego, of course. But I do think that he thought that this was going to mean that there's now more common feeling among people than there had been during the party conflict of the 1790s. And in that sense, Monroe was playing on he was trying to implement this program that Jefferson had laid out in his first inaugural address. So one theme of the book is that the first inaugural address really is a forecast of what these guys are going to end up doing for the next 6 terms. Of course, they don't realize there will be 6 terms or that it'll be the 3 of them, but they did try to implement the entire Republican program. And for the most part, it was successful. There's, of course, the one great exception, but for the most part, it worked as they envisioned and better than they had hoped.
But by the great exception, I take it you're pointing us toward the embargo and the War of 1812?
Oh, yes, the War of 1812, which is, of course, just an enormous disaster that was easily foreseeable when they decided that in the midst of the Great World War that they were living through, they would mothball much of the Navy and cut taxes and will rely on the militia, which proved not very effective during the Revolution. So, yeah, that's the great smear on their record, I think.
So what explains that? I mean, it strikes me that certainly we had endured during the 1790s the very difficult situation of being between Britain and France, if not geographically. Britain didn't want us trading with France and its allies. France didn't want us trading with Britain and its allies. Our ships were running into trouble on the high seas during the Adams administration, maybe especially after the passage of the Jay Treaty, which very much alienated France from us. During Jefferson's first term, this quiets down a good bit, but tensions heat up again after his second inauguration. And, the old, saw that second terms are never as good as first terms. Maybe, Washington's presidency is the first example of that. Jefferson's presidency is the second example of that. Adams's presidency would have been the second example had he had a second term,
Right.
But of course he never did. What do you think of critics who might say that Jefferson was really a hypocrite? I mean, here's a guy who, in his first inaugural address, goes out of his way to say that we're going to leave people free to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement, but then imposes an embargo, which, and I want to make sure people understand it, it outlaws all international trade, not just trade with Britain and France, but all international trade. I mean, that is a very heavy-handed action on the part of the national government. What brings Jefferson to the belief that that is a wise policy to pursue?
Well, because he pursues it because he thinks it's the one alternative to just conceding that the Federalists were right in the Adams administration to raise taxes and build up the Navy. So Jefferson was one who was not going to admit he had been mistaken in his major policy claims or his major philosophical commitments. And so this idea, which of course Madison had floated in the 1780s, it was in the air among leading Republicans for a long time before it was actually tried. This was the way to avoid admitting that the game had failed, that maybe the Federalists had a point when it came to arming the country, at least to some degree. Now, of course, the Federalists hadn't had in mind that the United States should be a military state the way that any major European power was. That was not the game, but they thought there should be a significant American Navy, and that in case there were a war, America would need professional soldiers. And Jefferson, we mentioned before, said in his first inaugural address that this was not necessary, that America had the strongest of governments. Although it might look weak, it was really strong because in case it needed to be defended, people would fly to defend it. Well, it turned out that not as many flew to defend it as Jefferson had prognosticated, and the ones who did were militarily incompetent. So it was a debacle to some extent, I think, the War of 1812. When I was a kid, people were taught that the only war America had ever lost was Vietnam, and apparently they thought that they won the War of 1812. Well, of course, I explain in the book how it was that people came to have that impression, but America didn't win the War of 1812.
I mean, it strikes me that in politics, luck is always shifting, and.
Right.
If Jefferson has the wind in his sails during his first term, if he lucks out with such amazing opportunities, such as the purchase of Louisiana, and it's not all luck. A lot of it is concerted effort and policy that is scrupulously followed through on. One person who appears throughout the book is Treasury Secretary Albert Gallatin. I mean, he's going to remain Madison's Treasury Secretary. He's going to remain a figure, an important figure throughout these administrations. And I think, the word that you used to describe him as parsimonious, I'll just call him stingy. But right. Boy, we could use a guy like Albert Gallatin these days with $31 trillion in national debt. He made it his singular focus to pay down the national debt that Jefferson had inherited from the Washington and Adams administrations. I think, through a combination of cutting expenses as well as seeing revenues naturally increase. Something like 37% of the national debt is paid off during Jefferson's presidency, even though we have the rather big splurge of, Louisiana, which came at a tune of 15 million. And we attempt to continue that during Madison's presidency, even though, for a couple of years, they just have to tell Gallatin to can it because, we've got a war to fight. Right. And with the embargo and the diminution of trade doesn't help our revenues either. But Gallatin is really trying, and I mean, maybe you could speak to the point that seems to animate Gallatin, and to a certain degree, these three presidents as well. Why did they consider it so important that the national debt be discharged?
Well, of course, the national debt eventually was discharged during the Jackson administration. And it's very common among libertarians, at least, to credit Jackson for that. But it was actually discharged on the day that Gallatin's program foresaw it being discharged. That is, it was Gallatin's doing. Of course, it could have been reversed by one of Monroe's successors, but none of them did reverse it. The point is, Gallatin was brought into the cabinet by Jefferson with the idea of paying off the debt, and Gallatin's chief initiative for heading in that direction was to reduce, if not eliminate, the U.S. Navy. So if the only concern were paying off the debt would be reasonable, but at a time when major powers were at war and the war was all around the United States, it was, I think, foreseeable that the United States would be drawn into that and needed to have some kind of military establishment to defend it in case that happened. So Gallatin is in many senses an admirable person, but on the other hand, he's an ideologue in office. He's devoted to one issue only, and this proves ruinous when the war comes, of course.
It is interesting when you think about what there was and what there wasn't available to cut, during these presidencies. I mean, we think of the Federalists as being the party of big government in the 1790s, and I suppose in the context of the 1790s they were, right. But it's not like Gallatin could have cut the agriculture department or the education department or health and human resources, right? I mean, so much of our present day federal bureaucracy did not yet exist. And so I suppose if you were looking to make actual cuts in spending, you would have to look at the military establishment first and foremost.
You would.
And yet somehow we manage to, I'm not willing to concede, Kevin, that we were defeated by the British in the War of 1812. It was a draw.
Okay.
And we fought them to a draw. The world's greatest superpower, right? I mean, Britain was the world's most powerful nation. It was the world's richest nation. I think arguably it was the world's second freest nation. So the British had a lot going for them. How was it? I mean, I know that you give Madison a tough time for his leadership during the War of 1812.
Well, I think it's hard to underestimate Madison's war leadership. Yeah. From the time he began choosing his cabinet, he just made terrible decisions in connection.
So you maybe I heard you wrong. You mean it's hard to overestimate his war leadership? I mean,
No. I'm saying it was so bad that it would be hard to exaggerate. For example, when he picks, in those days, one chose a Navy secretary and a war secretary who was the head of the army, essentially. And Madison chose for these positions a fellow who was such a dipsomaniac that he was disabled by noon every day for one of those jobs. And for the other one, he chose a fellow who had been a surgeon in the army during the Revolution. Well, neither of these fellows was appropriate for these tasks, as proved. And he ended up having terrible problems with the fellow who was his war secretary when the war came. Ended up more or less firing the guy for insubordination. But Madison overlooked the insubordination for over a year, and it just was hard. The extent to which the War of 1812, Madison's performance was a debacle is hard to exaggerate, really.
So
The one big black mark against these three guys, the War of 1812, was very, very poorly run by the president and the people he made his immediate subordinates. And some of the generals were utterly incompetent too. So
your book goes into this in greater detail, and I'll point out to the listeners that this is there's a lot of very even coverage in this book. I looked at part 1 and part 2 and part 3, and part 1, as one might expect, is just slightly longer than parts 3. Part 2, of course, deals with Madison. Part 3 deals with Monroe, but they're of about equal length. And it strikes me that you really look closely at all three of these presidencies. You devote considerable time and attention to the War of 1812. But so I'm obviously oversimplifying here. Would you agree at the end of the day that the outcome of the war was an example of how we just got lucky?
Yes, I would agree with that. Actually, supposedly there was a conversation between the Prime Minister and the Duke of Wellington in which the Prime Minister said, well, I'm going to give you an army and send you to North America. And the Duke said, okay, so I conquer the United States, and then what? And the Prime Minister said, well, then I guess we'll have to have a treaty. It's just, it was awful. It was just awful. They should have known better than to declare war without preparing first. And Madison repeatedly told Secretary Armstrong to prepare the approaches to DC, and he didn't do it, and Madison didn't do anything about it. So, oh boy.
Well, is it fair to say
as president, Madison made a great Secretary of State? I guess I'd put it that way.
That's a really great insult. Very well done. So well, instead of maybe continuously trashing James Madison, let's talk a little bit about the Hartford Convention, and let me indulge me in a counterfactual.
Okay.
So, the War of 1812, the capital of the United States is in flames.
Right.
A foreign army is marching through our territory. Right. We have a foreign navy in the Great Lakes, and a sizable portion of the people of New England, which is a sizable region at the time of the United States, are whispering about secession. We have leaders on the state level who are actively not complying with national calls for support for the war effort,
including the governor of Massachusetts, which was, of course, the most important state in the region. He was completely uncooperative.
And so it seems as if there was ever a time when a president might have used extraordinary war powers to clamp down on dissent, it would be the War of 1812. Mm-hmm. I mean, the ink wasn't even dry on the First Amendment in 1798 when it wasn't even an official war, the quasi-war with France. John Adams signed into law the Sedition Act. Mm-hmm. And we know subsequent periods of U.S. history. Maybe the Civil War is not a good example because, the capital of the United States almost would have been in flames, and there were troops marching throughout American territory. But World War I, World War II, we see curtailments of civil liberties. Mm-hmm. You don't see Madison doing that. And I can't help but wonder if Madison did, in fact, try to crush the dissent that was brewing in New England, if the outcome of the Hartford Convention might have been different. If rather than the people who gathered at Hartford, they came together and they passed a series of resolutions, and ultimately, if the national government didn't adopt their resolutions, what were they going to do? They were going to meet again, right? I mean, cooler heads prevailed, in other words. And I can't help but wonder if Madison had tried to exercise more muscular leadership and had come down harder on dissent in the United States, if in fact the problems that we associate with the War of 1812 might have grown to an even greater degree.
Well, this is the response that people make in defense of Madison as war president. But the thing is, I think we can distinguish between clamping down on constitutional dissent on one hand, and just making reasonable appointments to the Navy Secretary and the War Secretary positions, for example, or choosing generals who had some kind of record of knowing what they were doing. It's hard, again, it's just hard to exaggerate the extent to which he put people who weren't fit for posts in important posts. Mm-hmm. And actually, I mentioned in the book that when he had been out of office for about a decade, he received a letter from a younger Virginian who was turning to writing history. And he said to Madison, well, of course, I'm going to have to say something about I'm trying to remember exactly how the guy put it. It's in the book, but it's something like about the glaring incompetence of some of the people you appointed or something like that. And Madison explains to him that, well, of course, for somebody to be appointed to a top position in a cabinet, for example, he's going to have political support of his own. He's going to have to be financially independent. And he lists all these criteria, and among them is not, he's going to have to be capable of fulfilling the duties of the office, Right. So it's true that in those days, it took wealth to hold these top positions. It's not a surprise, or it's not an accident that people like Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe were president. It was a very expensive proposition to be president in those days. But that, I think, still doesn't excuse putting a drunk who's disabled by noon in one of the military cabinet posts, for example, or choosing a surgeon for another one, or picking people who were frightened at the sound of enemy guns to be generals in the army, or, it's just awful. People may have the impression from hearing our conversation that the section of the book on the Madison administration is entirely negative. It's not.
No, it's not.
It happens that you wanted to talk about his war leadership, which I think was poor.
Well, let me ask another question that will bring us into the Monroe presidency, but allow us to continue to talk about James Madison. I mean, you title your book "The Jeffersonians," and certainly, as was Jefferson, Madison and Monroe were both Jeffersonian Republicans. Mm-hmm. But who was the most Jeffersonian? Mm-hmm. I mean, was Monroe more Jeffersonian than Madison, or do you think that Madison had greater fidelity to the vision that Jefferson laid out in his first inaugural address than James Monroe did?
Well, maybe John Randolph was the most Jeffersonian. That's
he certainly thought so.
Pardon me?
He certainly thought so.
Yeah. And John Taylor and John Randolph. There are various congressional figures in the book who are more ideological than any of the presidents is. And of course, there's a difference between being a legislator and actually having to implement policy. It's an interesting question. I think that in general, Madison was Jeffersonian, but there were points when he wasn't. So, for example, people who've read my book about Madison know that I think he was a complete nationalist in the Philadelphia Convention, and he put off sending a copy or an account of the Philadelphia Convention to Jefferson for over a month after it ended, because he knew Jefferson wasn't going to like what he had to tell him. So there's that. He actually might have known that Jefferson wouldn't even like the Constitution, which is an interesting possibility. Monroe certainly was a Jeffersonian. There's just no doubt about it. So one part of what the book is about is arguing against the tradition of saying that there's a kind of break in American history in 1815 and then something new happens after. I think Monroe's presidency is more of the same degree, and so did he. Jefferson, of course, does some things that the more doctrinaire Republicans didn't like, but I do think that his first inaugural address really does lay out the program that all three of them are going to follow, more or less. I think you can say that all three of them were definitely Jeffersonian to a very large degree in office. It wasn't only an opposition persuasion; it was a governing persuasion.
It's interesting though, because when readers reach the end of your book, you conclude on a poignant note.
Right.
You point that after Monroe's presidency, we have the election in the House of Representatives, of course, of John Quincy Adams as president.
Right.
And Adams very much liked to present himself as being a person who transcends partisanship. He's not a Federalist. He's not a Republican. He's not either of those things. He's all of those things and none of those things. And we can break free of the prison of this dichotomy, which had once trapped us. But in his inaugural address, he lays out all of these different government programs, all of these different projects, lighthouses in the sky. I mean, nationally, all of it, and all of it without the sanction of any corresponding constitutional amendment. Right. And you point out that Jefferson, though, his friendship with John Quincy Adams, his father, has been patched up, and they're engaged in their amazingly enlightening, wonderful to read correspondence. There is a bit of the old Federalist still alive in John Quincy Adams. There is a bit of the Hamiltonian,
I think so, definitely, yes.
And Jefferson is not
sees it, yes. Yeah, so Jefferson, at the very end of his life, drafted another series of resolutions for the Virginia legislature to adopt, basically laying out that, Virginia remained Republican, remained Jeffersonian, even though the new president seemed to be a Federalist. And that's where you have one more opportunity for James Madison to keep Jefferson from doing what he wanted to do. He says, let's see how things work. So Jefferson kind of puts politics aside, I think. He actually congratulated John Adams on his son's taking office. I think he must have done that after reading the inaugural address, which, he must have completely loathed. It was absolutely Federalist.
I love the last three sentences of your book. You conclude, so Madison is aware of Jefferson's misgivings regarding John Quincy Adams's proposals for policy. And you're right that James Madison persuaded Jefferson to keep these resolutions to himself. His day was past, or so it seemed.
Right.
And it's almost as if you're setting us up for a sequel when Thomas Jefferson comes back.
Well, we know that Jeffersonian principles would come back with a vengeance in the South not too much later, but for a while in Jefferson's life, they were no longer going to be animating. So
we have just about 5 minutes left, and I mean, we could continue conversing for hours, I have no doubt. But we actually have a question from the YouTube chat, and I'm going to take the liberty of expanding it a little bit. Since you mentioned the coming of the Civil War, the question deals with women, but perhaps we could broaden it to include these Jeffersonians' thoughts on African Americans as well. The question was, what were Jefferson's thoughts on the equality of women? Did he believe they had the capacity for higher intellect? And then what about women farming is the question.
Well, boy, we have 5 minutes, huh?
And asking you to expand it to include African Americans as well.
Well, okay, let's see how quickly.
So let's take on race and gender. Go.
Yes. Well, Jefferson had 3 children, one of whom died extremely young, one of whom died when she was a young adult, and the other of whom outlived him. And he wrote at an early point that the question had to do with education for women. And he wrote at an early point, well, my daughters are going to marry blockheads, so it's you don't want to educate them too much because
Right.
they're happy in that kind of situation. However, Martha, the one who outlived him, was clearly an educated woman, very intelligent. And that obviously Jefferson had something to do with that. And on the other hand, I show in the book that at one point, Albert Gallatin, you mentioned, was Treasury Secretary, and that meant he was in charge of federal lighthouses.
Right.
So he had the idea that he ran by Jefferson that a lighthouse keeper had died, and he said, well, how about replacing him with his wife? And Jefferson wrote back, the American people aren't ready for women in political office, and neither am I. So this was in the 1800s. On the other hand, when it came to blacks, my immediate previous book was about Jefferson. It's called Thomas Jefferson Revolutionary, not a biography. It's about his political program. And after it was published, I got a letter from a professor at William & Mary, who's a historian of American education. And he said, you know, your book is the first book ever to mention that Jefferson said that the bill for the more general diffusion of knowledge could be read as applying to black people. And I think Jefferson thought that black people could be educated just as white people. He didn't really think there was some kind of genetic distinction between the brains of black and white people or the intelligence of black and white people. He did, however, say something in that same letter would make you gasp. He said, as to slaves, it's unclear to me whether being educated would make them happier, which, wow, how about that? But anyway, he had the idea that ultimately black kids in Virginia would be educated too. So make of that what you will. And to some degree, he was a man of his time, but in general, he was looking toward the way things could be improved. And his program was about improving things in a direction that we would find congenial, even if all the details, weren't au courant in 2022.
Right.
And so one task of a historian, of course, is to try to contextualize things. You don't want to judge Jefferson by 2022 standards. And by the standard of his own time, he was way ahead of other people in these connections, besides the fact that Gallatin did want to appoint a woman to be a lighthouse keeper.
I think it is worth pointing out, too, when you think about the important contributions of Jefferson's presidency, at the first constitutionally allowable moment,
Right.
He called on Congress to pass a bill bringing about an end to the international slave trade.
Right.
And
Right.
and so, that is a significant achievement that I think people oftentimes overlook. Certainly,
Right.
it didn't, prevent slavery from continuing to exist within the United States, but it did at least legally prevent, people being kidnapped in Africa and brought in chains to the New World and sold legally in the United States.
Right.
And that's something.
Yeah, I discussed that in the book too. And in fact, people may wonder, well, what about smuggling? But for all we know, there wasn't very much smuggling of people into slavery in America after that. It seems to have been a very effective law.
So we have about 1 minute left. I just want people to realize this is a really readable book. I mean,
Great.
It is a delight to read. I think, my students will enjoy it in the future. Certainly I enjoyed it. Share your thoughts on writing. I mean, what is it about you unlike some other professors? I won't name any names, but how is it that you're able to write in such a clear and concise sort of way?
Oh boy. Well, I imagine I'm writing for my mother, who's now deceased, but she in her last years took to reading American history about the Revolution and after. Unfortunately, she didn't live to see my books on this period. But, she was the kind of standard, intelligent lay reader. And so I think of writing for somebody like that. I also try to repress my own impulse to use lots of commas and semicolons and, just punctuate far too much and make sentences run on forever. That's a real struggle for me. But anyway, thank you for the compliment. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you for the very well written book. I appreciated that. Well, listen, let's very briefly talk about your research. I mean, it's worth noting that This was hosted by the National Archives and Records Administration. I know that you used a number of different repositories and a number of different sources. Is there anything from the National Archives that you would recommend to people as far as resources that they might use?
Well, I see over your shoulder many of the books I used in writing this book. There is a site or I don't know, sub-site. There are materials on the Library of Congress website called Founders Online, National
Archives website.
Yeah,
yes.
National Archives website. So you can just Google Founders Online National Archives and find all the surviving writings and all the surviving letters received by, for example, Jefferson and Madison. But there are many other people whose surviving writings are on that website too. I highly recommend it. I used it quite a lot in writing this book.
I agree. That is a tremendous resource and something that really turbocharges scholarship in a way that wasn't available to us when we were graduate students.
Right. I wish we'd had it. Yes.
Well, Kevin, I wish we could speak, for hours and hours, but unfortunately, we've only been given 1 hour and our hour has come to an end. But I really want to thank you for, allowing me to have this conversation with you. I've enjoyed it. I hope our viewers have enjoyed it. And I hope that this will sort of whet their appetite for the period and cause them to go out and buy your book. Once again, it is called The Jeffersonians, the Visionary Presidencies of Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. Thank you, Kevin.
You're welcome. Thank you.